Good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name's Alex, and today I'll be talking about ES rule sets. If you're new to our GoToWebinar series, we have a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the next month, we'll put it on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. I've also been trying to post them on our Zendesk too, so you can keep an eye out for them there as well. If you're new to our GoToWebinar series, we have a Zoom button in the upper left of the main GoToWebinar window. If my screen displays too large or too small, you can click that to adjust the fit. In the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a Q&A area where any questions you might have, type them in there, and typically we do Q&A at the end, but if any particularly pertinent points pop up, I may pause to address them on the spot. So already went over that stuff. So as far as the agenda, this was, I'm kind of piggybacking on Mike did a part 2 to his ETWiST webinar last month. And I was looking back, I did a rule sets webinar, I think about 3 years ago, and I'd mentioned there as well that I'd wanted to do a part 2. So I figured I'd piggyback off his idea and do the same thing. So the first webinar focused on all the nuts and bolts and essentials of getting rule sets set up and working. So I'm assuming you have some basic familiarity with rule sets. If not, the previous webinar was the September 2017 webinar. There was a link in the mailer that went out. If you need a link to that, you can also email me directly. There's also a link to it posted in our Zendesk portal. If you want to review any of the information in there, if anything of this is a little too complex. As far as what we're going to be covering, I have 7 different examples in here, and this is going to be focused a little more like, I guess, an actual tips and tricks rather than a deep dive into a topic. These are 7 different things you can do with, assuming I can count right, 7 different things you can do with rule sets that are all kind of separate from each other. So the first, I'll be showing you how you can use nested regular expressions to make your rules a little less complex. I'll be showing you how you can link multiple rule sets to a common input channel and some of the pitfalls you might run into. I'll show you how to add metadata to files while they're undergoing that rule evaluation, in case there's anything you want to capture from the file name or the path or even the rule it matched at that time. I'll be showing you how you can use rule prefixes to reroute, for example, split pages to specific workflows or specific rules. I'll show you how you can send files directly to ETWiST if you want to use it kind of like a standard twist or sort of a cheat or a workaround using rules. I'll show you how you can use multi-part rule evaluation to simplify checking on if you've got more complex situations where you need to pre-check one portion and you don't want to retype it every time for the next dozen rules. And then lastly, I'll show you how you can use programmatic expressions to handle offsets or other kind of compensations during that rule evaluation process. So to get things started, a very brief recap of how rule sets work. In ES, file input is split into 2 portions. You have an input channel, which is where the actual upload's happening, whether that's in a customer within the ES UI, whether that's a hot folder on the local ES system, or perhaps even an FTP server somewhere. The input channel is an input channel is a collection of one or more related input pipes of those types, and that input channel is then linked to a rule set. And a rule set is a hierarchical list of just different rules that can be used to analyze the file upload path or the file naming convention to determine where it gets mapped to. By standard, ES handles all this for you. If you're uploading into a project, it has its own rules pre-baked, where if you're just uploading through the ES interface, it'll handle all that for you. Where this comes into play is where perhaps you have more complex cases where certain files need to go through a specific workflow, or you need to make sure that files conform to a certain naming convention so that you're sure they're really ready to go into that project, or more commonly when you're dealing with hot folder uploads, because unlike the ES UI, if you're just dumping into a hot folder, you need to tell it how those files get mapped to a project somewhere. So just to give an example, I have here my input channel we'll be dealing with for today. I have 2 of them. I have one that's just a hot folder, and this is the local hot folder on my ES server. This is linked to a rule set called Webinar Demo Corp. And I have another one here for any uploads through the interface to my Demo Corp customer. This one's set up a little differently for some test scenarios, which is why I have this linked to 2 different rules. And then I've got also got one other one I won't get into now that's for 1/3 case. But this is basically how it works. I have my input channels, they're linked to this rule set. The rules are evaluated hierarchically. So whenever a file comes into my hot folder or my UI input channel, it goes to this rule set. It starts with this first rule. It'll look at that rule to see if it matches. And if it does match, then what it'll do is it'll go ahead and map the file as defined in here. If not, it'll move on to the next rule and try again and again and again until it runs out of rules. Which is why you generally want to have these things organized, the most specific rules and the most complex rules at the top, and then the catch-alls and more generic rules at the bottom. The actual mapping is based off of whatever criteria you give it in here. You're building a regular expression. This one has slashes in it to indicate folder paths. This is based on the standard ES UI uploading structure. If you go into an ES project, for example, and click the upload button, behind the scenes, it uploads it into a temporary folder on your ES server. And that temporary folder structure has 4 main components. The year that the project was created, that's part of, it's a kind of a compound unique identifier that it uses to manage these projects. The year is technically part of the project ID, but it uploads it into a folder based on the year the project was created, and the subfolder based on the project template name, a third full subfolder based on the project ID, and then within that, the file itself. And so the basic uploads just follow that, and they map these atoms here to each of those criteria that ES needs to assign this file to a project. You don't have to worry about too much about their standard naming convention, other than knowing that you have to accommodate for those first 3 atoms if you're dealing with anything that's been uploaded through the ES UI. And then from there on, this 4th atom, you can really do whatever you want if you need to break out, for example, and say that needs to start with 1 or more numbers followed by an underscore or something of that nature. For hot folder uploads, you don't have to worry about that because you build your own structure. But that's how the mapping generally works. One thing I'd wanted to do in this webinar that didn't quite work out is I went through a few years worth of tickets dealing with rule sets. I was trying to figure out where people get stuck on these things, and the common pitfalls are the same ones I honestly run into while preparing the webinar even. So if you've watched part 1 and you're still getting acclimated to these rules and the rule set configuration, the 4 most common issues we've run into are having the rules in the wrong order, where someone will place a general rule at the very top. So if you have a catch-all rule that's supposed to catch any kind of file and assign it to like a staging area, you want that towards the bottom, because if you put that at the top and you have a very specific rule that's supposed to send cover files with a specific naming convention to a certain workflow, it's going to match that catch-all for if that comes to the top, and it'll never reach your specific rule. The second issue, which I forgot to do it like 10 times while I was preparing the webinar, is forgetting to link your rule set to your input channel. I do this on a regular basis because you go in here, you make an input channel, you set up your pipe, you see that it needs a rule set, so you hit save, it's like, okay, I'll go make that, and then you forget to link it, you upload files into the project, and you wonder why nothing happens. That's one to watch out for. One fun one is new naming convention mismatches old rules. It's fairly common to have one common rule set for most use cases. Usually people will piggyback on the default upload rule set that ships with ES. And maybe you'll have a naming convention that was put in here for a specific customer, and perhaps they're not printing with you anymore, or they're not using the system, or they changed their naming convention. You've got kind of a ghost rule just lingering in here. You might run into, we've seen issues where maybe then you've got a new customer that comes in, or someone changes their naming convention, and by bad luck they happen to match that old rule, and a file winds up somewhere where you don't expect it to go. That's one thing to watch out for, and a good recommendation there is for any highly specialized cases, it's a good idea to split out people into their own input channels and rule sets where you might run into conflicts like that, and also to pare down if you're using common rule sets, because they can be useful, is to pare those down. And once you know that a rule is not being used any longer, get rid of it so it doesn't come back to bite you later. The fourth is, I guess, errors by duplication. If you've got like a naming structure or something set up like this, you're not going to enter that from scratch every time. You just hit the duplicate button because it's easier. But the problem is, and I actually did it a few times while preparing for the webinar, is sometimes you copy a rule and then you forget there's something in that rule that doesn't fit your use case. So maybe you duplicated, you had like a rule that was meant for multi-page documents or for JPEGs, and you liked how the naming convention was set up, the regular expressions. So you went ahead, you copied it, and then it's not, your single pages aren't coming into this. And then you realize, oh, this rule is set to prevent multi-page documents from coming in. So that's one thing to watch out for. It's really easy to actually find a rule that has one of those set when you're duplicating if you don't watch out for it. But it's enough prologue there. I'll get into the new examples. So as a good first example, what I was thinking I'll show you is nested regular expressions. And I don't think this is something we could historically do in TipsTricks back in the day. So here's a pretty straightforward rule. I forget where I hid this thing. I think it was, here we go. So I've got a rule in here. What this rule is going to do is I've got some imaginary products here. For maybe I'm using ES as sort of like a PIM or a product information manager. And I'm uploading these to a hot folder. And I want it to automatically create a project based off, let me get my customer up here. I want it to automatically create a project based off the SKU name in my file name, but I also want to keep the file name intact. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go copy these two files over here to upload them. Now what this rule set is going to do is it's going to break this down into 3 atoms, because we're interested in getting the SKU name from the front of the file name. And then a lot of times, because you can't, one of the downsides of this MIME area here is you can technically limit this to only pick up PDFs by setting the MIME type to application PDF. But if you're dealing with PNGs or something, you can't type your own value in there and save it. So what a lot of folks tend to wind up doing, myself included, is just put the extension name at the end of the rule to verify that it matches. Now, in this case, we're taking that first atom and we are making that the project name is SKU followed by that first atom. Then we're hard coding the customer to demo corp here because we know it's their file. It came in through their input channel. And then for the file name, we're kind of rebuilding the file name here by taking all the atoms that we separated out, because we had to split out the SKU, but we want that in the file name in this case, perhaps. So the standard route to do this has typically been to just type all the atoms in and basically rebuild the file name from scratch. And to be fair, it does work. If we go in here, we'll see that it did create a project and our file came in okay. But what if there was an easier way? I should delete this because I uploaded both my examples at once. But let's say what if there was an easier way? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this rule. I'm going to go ahead and enable this rule here, which is the newfangled way of doing this with nested regular expressions. And I'm going to go toss one of my files back in again. And what this is going to do is, actually I'll show you in the old one because it's a little easier to see it in action. So this is what we're starting with. But what if we don't want to rebuild this from scratch? What we can do is we'll get rid of, we're not really extracting anything from here except the fact that we need to put it back on the file name when we rebuild it like this. So why not instead just, we'll nest this in here. So now we have one atom nested inside a larger one. So you can see the first one gives me the full file name. And the second one gives me just the SKU. So then really all I would have to do here is change this so that my document name is set to Atom number 1, and my project name is set to SKU followed by Atom number 2, and that will do the trick. Now, the other benefit this has too, and if we look here, we can see that that did do the job, and it did pull my file in. And I bet if we went into the registered files area, you'll see it working with that new rule too. Now, the other reason that this can be useful is because with the old method, if you change your naming convention up here or your regular expression, you might have to remember to update the document name down here so that it matches that new naming convention. With this, you have the name all in one. You don't have to worry about futzing with this if anything changes or any changes introducing problems there. So that's our first little demo case. Second one here is multiple rule sets. And I'm sure this is something that a lot of you have played with, but there is one catch to it that I wanted to make sure I showed because it's caught a few people off guard in tickets recently. So I have here an upload channel for anything coming into the ES via the web interface here is going to be put through first my Webinar Demo Corp rule set, and then secondly this upload rule set here. And it's going to go through those in order. So it's going to start with the Demo Corp rule set. It's going to go through each of these rules one by one and see if it finds something that matches. If it doesn't, it's going to move on to the upload rule set, the standard upload rule set, and see if anything matches and just carry on that way. So the scenario here is I have some files that I'm going to upload into this project here. I'll just use the same project because it's already created. And what this is going to do is I have either cover pages or body pages. And maybe I have a case where my cover files need to go through a specific workflow. So what I did here is, I think I should have more files that should be cropping in here momentarily. But actually, let's see what happened in this body pages because I think something just went wrong. So I have a teachable moment here. So here's my body pages. Oh, these, okay. It looks like actually one of my nested regular expression example is conflicting here. So I'm going to switch that back to the old school way for now. I probably should have made that a little more specific with the underscore here. I think that actually should work fine if I put that back in. So let's try that one more time. I'll delete all these guys. Yeah, it's just a typo on my part, I think. Yep, there we go. We're good. So you can see here that, so it wasn't a problem with the nested regular expression. It was just a problem with I typoed something differently in that rule. So it was catching these files mistakenly. So you can see here my files came in. All my cover pages are running through a special Demo Corp covers workflow. All my body pages are running through the stock standard WIFL dialog that ships with ES. Because maybe in this case the covers need to go to their own workflow. You might have a case where, like this, where a customer has one or two specific instances where they need their own workflow, but otherwise they're following the standard rules to the letter. So the way this works is that it went through the evaluation. If we look at any of these files in here now, you can see for the covers, it went through until it found my specific cover workflow rule in here, and then it rolled with that because that existed in my Webinar Demo Corp rule set. For these body pages here, those went through the whole Webinar Demo Corp rule set, but they didn't match. So after that, it went to the next linked rule set. We can see we got upload in here. the upload rule set. It went through that until it matched a regular expression in there and went through with that, running with the workflow set in that rule. Now, this works pretty much so far as you'd expect it. Here's where the snag comes into play. I'm going to go up to my rule sets here, and I'm going to turn on the bad rule that breaks everything. And I'm going to delete these pages and I'm going to re-upload. This being the rule that's supposed to break everything, not like my other one. So now what we're going to find is we see our cover and body pages are both coming in. But the strange thing here is that they're not running, the cover pages are no longer running through that special workflow. And all I did was I turned on one rule that shouldn't even really do anything with these files. So here's what happened. This rule is, we're assuming in this case, this is a rule that maybe was for another customer and conflicts with my other rule. And maybe in this case, rather than being the standard ES hierarchy like this, you'd see for an upload through the interface, this was a hot folder upload that happened to have a similar regular expression associated with it. And for this particular rule, maybe the customer name was the first atom instead of the year, like it would be with an ES upload through the UI. What will happen in this case is it would match my file would match the rule, and ES tries to apply the rule, but there's no customer named 2020 for the current year, and it can't create a customer. So you'd expect it to move on then and go to the next rule, and then match this rule in place correctly. But it won't do that. ES only attempts to place once per rule set. If it tries to place on a rule and it fails, it assumes something went wrong, and it doesn't want to try any of those rules that follow it in case it's not supposed to match those. So it'll give up on that rule set altogether and move to the next rule set. So in this case, it went through all these rules. If it got to the bad rule that breaks everything here, it tried to assign it based on that rule. And when it failed, it didn't move on to the correct rule underneath. It jumped straight to the upload rule set instead, and then matched with the generic rule down here. This is something we've seen come up a few times recently because it's not something you'd expect from first glance, and it's caught some people off guard. So I figured I'd mention it. That's one thing to watch out for. So go to example number 3 here is I'll do metadata tagging during rule evaluation. So for my scenario here, I have 2 different types of files. I'll say, well, I'm producing a magazine, and I've got editorial pages and I've got ads, and they've got 2 different naming conventions. My editorial pages here have a digit at the front, underscore, ED, and then some other stuff. My ads start with Z and then some digits, and this is, in this scenario, my ad reservation number, and I'm using that rather than page number to associate this ad. So there's 3 different things I want to collect here. I'll get them all in one example. The first is, what if I wanted to tell whether a page was ad or editorial? They're going into the same exact workflow, but I wanted to know whether a page is editorial or ad in the workflow. I could always make a programmed link with JavaScript to go in and look at the file name and pull it apart, but I'm already pulling the file name apart in the rule evaluation here. I might as well grab the information while I'm looking. The other thing that I might want to grab, and this has come up a few times recently too, is we've had people ask if there is a way to tell which input rule or which rule set pulled the file in from later on in the process within an ES workflow. And there is no baked-in way to do that, unfortunately, but we can write metadata in rule sets, so we can type in the rule set or the rule itself as metadata and have that associated with the file so that you can just look at that metadata in the workflow. And then the third case, if we're going for fun, is why not actually just grab the ad reservation ID as well while we're at it. So the way I have this set up here is I have a metadata set. Scroll down here, and I've got our 3 variables here. We've got page type, which is an enumeration, which can be either add or edit. we've got a string for add reservation ID, and we've got a string for input channel. And if we want to use these in a rule set, there's one thing we got to do up here. We got to go into System Tools. This is kind of hidden, not statistics. What am I thinking? System Configuration. It's like Douglas Adams, way down in the basement, in Odysseus' basement, in a filing cabinet labeled "Beware of the Leopard." They've hidden this option in here. Rule set properties options. And what this does is it allows you to specify which metadata properties are allowed to be set in a rule set. This is something an administrator would set. So if you've got someone who's an admin with limited permissions, they can't tweak with this. But what this, you can say in here that, okay, here's my 3 metadata properties. I want these to be available and accessible in a rule set. So you define the metadata properties, you make them accessible in here, and then we can go into our actual rule. And while I'm at it, let me actually upload a few of these files. If memory serves, I think the way I have this rule set up, I can just dump them straight in from the web. Yep, so let me just delete a few of these examples. And I'll push these in so they can process while we take a look. So what this rule is going to do is, first off, for the editorial pages, all this is pretty much standard. We've got our 3 main items for an ES UI upload. We're pulling out, actually I should change that example so that we're pulling out the number at the front of the page for this page folio if we're doing like a flat plan situation. What we're doing here is we're just setting, in this case, I'm actually just hard coding. We know that it matched this rule. This rule is for editorial pages. So we're hard coding the page type metadata to edit. We're also hard coding the input channel to Webinar Demo Corp UI. And technically, I'm cheating a little here because we have 2 input channels feeding into this rule set. But for the purposes of the webinar, it's close enough. I know that anything that matches this rule, because of these 3 atoms, is coming from the this particular rule set or input channel. So that's just hard coding there. Now the second one here is this add setup. And what I'm doing here is I have, again, hard coding the page type to add, hard coding the input channel to Webinar Demo Corp UI. But I'm also taking the 5th atom here, I'm taking this add reservation code, and I'm setting that as the value of this metadata. So if I come over here to my project, and I look at any of these pages, you'll see here that for, this is one of my ads, you'll see that I've got my add reservation ID, I've got my input channel, and my page type is add. Same for the other ad here. And for the editorial pages, you'll see they have just the page type and the input channel here. So that's just one useful thing. It could also be useful if, because we've batted this around, me and the other techs in the past, trying to think of scenarios where this would be useful. Because a lot of times you can just set this stuff in the workflow itself in like a JavaScript link. But if it makes sense, I guess, if you're tearing apart file names, if it's something specific to the rule, or the third case, I guess, would be if it's specific to the upload path. So if there's a specific hot folder you're dumping into that's acting as metadata in that case, like the hot folder has the SKU name or an add reservation code that's not actually going to be embedded in the file, that would be another case where you might embed that in. You could kind of use that like dynamic hot folders in ETWiST, I guess, even. So that's that. The next example, we'll do rule patterns, which this is one other case where, let me clean up a few of these so this is easier to see. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to split a single page PDF or a multi-page PDF. This is about 32 pages in it, into a bunch of single pages. And the way that this is going to work is my rule, if I go over, actually, I'll go over here. I'm trying to keep these 2 windows separate so I don't have to jump between admin and project view on you guys. So what this is going to do is I have a very generic rule that catches anything uploaded to the ES interface. And this is pretty much just a stock ESUI upload rule where it's mapping all ES's general fields. Now what we're doing here though is I have this set to limit so that only multi-page PDFs will match this rule. If a multi-page PDF comes in, we're assigning it like normal, but we're sending it through a special workflow called Demo Corp Multipage. Now what this workflow is going to do is it's going to just take that file, it's going to generate a preview thumbnail. I have the draft option set in here too. If you've never played with it, if you're dealing with large multi-page documents, draft tells preview generation to only generate a thumbnail for the first page. So that if you have someone uploads a 1,000-page PDF, it's not going to have to generate thumbnails from every page in that 1,000 pages. This is something you'd want to enable if you were dealing with those massive PDFs, but you weren't actively looking at them a lot in ES. If you were regularly going into Dialog and going through every page in a multi-page, then I would leave this option off because Dialog would have to generate those a fresh render every time you went in. But I'm just doing that, and I'm pushing it into the PDF split tool, which will split it into the multi-page into singles. And in here we have what we call a rule pattern. PDF split and document step are the two tools that have rule patterns. And what these say is when a tool is creating a new page, that will get rerouted through the rule that the initial page matched. But you can give it a prefix. You can basically specify what information you want to be available so that can be matched in a rule later on. So I name this demo split. A colon, my customer name, a colon, and then my project name. And what that's going to do is, you can see that these pages came in. My rule here is going to look for anything that starts with demo split and at the front of the file name. Then what it's going to do is the first atom after that it knows is the get rid of that slash there. Anything that comes, actually I might need to put a slash in here, but what this is going to do is anything that matches here is going to be my customer name. This would be my project name, and this third one will be my file name itself. So, well, let's see here. That's all good. So that way, you know that because it starts with this prefix, you know that it came from this split, and you can send it off to a separate specific workflow if you want to later on. And we can see here that that's what happened for these. If I go into the registered files view here, you'll see that if I look at any of these individual pages, you'll see that this is the path that it's evaluating, so that I could match to that specific rule. If you don't set a rule pattern in either document step or PDF split, then it'll go with whatever. It'll just push it back into that rule set with, I think, the same rule that the initial page matched. But one other thing to keep in mind. But let's see here. So next thing, and this is one that's been shown quite a few times, but it's quick, so I figured I'd mention it just because. This is, I know Mike's shown this a few times. Generally, if you have ETWiST, unlike normal twist, you generally can't, unless you cheat a little bit, upload files directly into ETWiST like you can a standard twist server. Standard twist, you have a PDF you want to push through, you just upload and run with it. ES, the standard deal is you're dealing with rather than that kind of on-the-go file processing, or a file gets uploaded to Twist, is normalized and gone from the system. ES is more towards business process workflow and long-term storage. So what if you don't have a standard Twist server, you have an ETWiST server, and you just want to dump something straight through, or you want to use like an ES FTP watcher to send a file to ETWiST? What you can do is, we have a special case here. I've got a rule in my rule set, the ETWiST shuffle. And I just made a folder here to make this simple. I have a special folder here. Anything that goes into this folder will match this rule because it's looking for anything in the ETWiST shuffle folder. What this is going to do is anything it gets, uploaded into this rule is going to be processed through the watermark ES workflow. And what that watermark workflow is going to do is it's just a, help if I could spell. Here we go. It's just an input files to a watermark ETWiST step. And that ETWiST workflow itself is just a simple workflow just to show that it works. I'm pushing it in, I'm stamping a watermark on the file with merge XP, and then I'm outputting it to a local folder somewhere. Kind of like you do with a basic TWiST workflow. I'm not concerned about long-term storage here. Maybe I'm delivering to someone's FTP, like a customer's FTP. So the reason that this works is because, go back to my rule, I got too many windows open. So the reason that this works is because I have something in here specifically. This is set to, in the rule behavior here, it's set to upload each document as file not assigned. Typically, in 99% of cases where you're dealing with ES, you're going to want to have this option enabled, upload each document and revision the production structure. What that tells ES is, if the file matches this rule and you know how to map it to something, just map it there and let it do its thing. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to, but in this case, we don't want to actually assign it to a project. We're running it through a workflow, but we're not actually assigning it to a project. So it just gets run through a workflow, and then ES is done with it as far as it's concerned. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to upload, I got files here. I'll just dump this guy in. ETWiST shuffle. And if I watch ETWiST here, I should see this thing pop into, yep. This popped into ETWiST. And I bet if we bump here to our output folder, you'll see that it made a new file here. So we got our watermark slapped onto that page just fine. The one downside to this approach is it makes do if you don't have a standard TWiST server and you need to just run something one and done through TWiST. The one problem is that it's very opaque. Typically, you'd have to check the TWiST logs or look at like the TWiST Wiffle server log to see what happened here. There is not terribly much logging in ES where you can go in and look at a workflow diagram. Specifically, if you're doing like an ES document workflow, there's no real great way of seeing what happened during the workflow run. There would also be, I think, hints in the event log, but it's not a cohesive thing like where you can go into a project and just hit show workflow to bring up a history of that workflow. You can't do that in this case. The other scenario where I guess this might be useful, I've mainly only seen this used to cheat files into ETWiST, but I suppose it would also be useful if you needed to, like for example, a file didn't match and you needed to let the customer know. You could probably make a workflow with a input file and then a digital delivery to send an email saying, hey, your file didn't match a naming convention, fix it. So one other case where I can see that being useful. Two more examples here. It looks like we'll actually be ending on time for a change. So this one is actually somewhat related. When we're looking at these rule options, you've got your different options here. Try assigning the production structure. I think that won't overwrite revisions. You've got the file not assigned, which you can use to run a workflow without assigning files. And the standard upload, if you can match it and upload it, then upload it. There's two I've always wondered about when I see them here, because I've never really known what sense to make of them. And so I actually want to bugging Dalim, because the two I never really understood were rule behavior. When filter criteria matches, use next rule. And when filter criteria does not match, stop. I was considering these on their own, and they didn't really make sense to me, because why would you want, when it matches a rule, why would you want to use the next rule instead of just using this rule? And for the filter criteria, when a rule doesn't match, why would you want it to stop? Because as I thought about it when I was trying to think about this, the only case I could understand where you'd want to use this is at the end, because if you set something to stop, it's never going to hit the rules after it. So why would you put that anywhere other than the last rule? And in that case, why have it? But it turns out the only case where these work is in conjunction. The only scenario where this really seems to make sense is when you use them together. And the scenario in that case becomes when something matches this rule, use the next rule. But if it doesn't match the rule, then stop evaluating and jump to the next rule set. It makes sense in that scenario. And the specific example Dalim gave when I asked them was this makes sense if you have a scenario where you need to verify something like a code or a folder structure, but you don't want to do that in every subsequent rule in case it changes or because it's cumbersome. So the scenario I came up with here is, and I kind of shoehorned it. It looks a little weird sandwiched into this rule set, but the idea is just treat these three rules as their own for now if you're looking at this. We've got a case where I'm going to be uploading files into a hot folder, and I need to know that that hot folder matches my add reservation ID. It needs to be Z followed by some number of digits. If it doesn't match that, I don't want to deal with it. Then what I could always do is I could put that into every single rule. I could have the folder path, and then I could have the file name checks. But maybe I have, rather than 2 rules, I have 10 or 20 rules, and I don't want to have to enter that add reservation ID regular expression to every one of those, or maybe I'm concerned about it changing in the future. What you could do is I have a rule here that it's going to check anything uploaded to my hot folder. It's going to verify that that folder matches the naming convention. And so if I have a folder named like this, it's going to match. And in that case, it would go on to evaluate these next 2 rules. If the folder naming convention doesn't match, so if I have a folder just named like LOL or something, it's going to stop right then and there, and it's never going to evaluate the next rules. What that means is that I can then, without having to define all the specifics of that add code, I can define different criteria for example, in this case, I want to put PDFs and images in separate folders based on their MIME type. So how this works is, let me go ahead and I'll dump maybe 2 of these test files into here. And I'll dump this other one into the folder that doesn't match the naming convention. And you'll see it created a new project based off that add code. My rules created folders for design and photography based on the file's MIME type. And you can see my files made it in. But the one that I dumped, the one that ended in 12, didn't make it in because if I look at the rule evaluation here, you'll see that for one of the ones that was good, we went through our rule sets. We matched this code, so it moved on and checked the next rules. It saw that this file, for example, wasn't a PDF, so it didn't match my first rule. It matched my second rule, which said this is a image, put it in the images folder. Now, this other one here, it didn't match the naming convention for that folder, so it stopped and didn't go any further. So it never got to those other rules, even though it would have technically matched them. So that's the only scenario where I can see this making sense, though, is if you need to check something like a ID or something, and you don't want to have to put that in every single one of like 20 or 30 checks because you're worried it might change someday. That's a scenario where you might wind up using it with both the use next rule, when filter matches, use next rule, otherwise stop. So it's kind of a neat one. Now, one last example here. And this is something I've shown, I think, in a few of the flatplan-based webinars or imposition webinars, but I think I'll show it again. So you've got a case where we've got a job here, and this one's under a different customer. I finally split it out because my rule set was getting too cluttered. But I've got a job in here, and the way this is set up, my job is 16 pages. I've got 4 covers inside and outside, labeled with CV1, CV2, CV3, CV4. And then my body pages are labeled from 1 to 12. So typically, when you extract a folio name from a page, page numbers tend to be counted from the beginning of the flat plan. In this case, I had to cheat and add an offset in here. This is something standard if you want your first body page to be page 1. What I did is I made the cover pages have a CV prefix, so that I know that then they're mapped based on the prefix and the section number position. So rather than being cover page, that's how, rather than being cover page 15 and 16 at the end, this was cover 3 and 4 because my cover section has 3 pages, and they're wrapped around the outside based off the binding type I chose. The inside pages, there's only 12, and these are set so that the offset is -2. So what this is going to do is, rather than the first body page being page 3, it would subtract 2 from that. The first body page would be labeled 1. But there's technically a distinction there because this is still page 3. It just labels as page 1. So we need to find a way in the upload of changing these, accommodating for those offsets. And the way I did that is by, you go in here and go into my rules here. This is just using a standard upload through the UI. What I did in here is I set up, and actually let me upload the pages while these can crunch through. So what these are doing is they're doing something special in here, where I'm just doing a standard extraction of the page name, but the page number in here, and I'm knowing that either they're named cover or body here. I know which they are. But what I'm doing in here on this tab is, this is where you typically set the folio. So in a normal job, you might say that your page number would be the 5th atom here, so it would be page 3. But in this case, this is the 3rd cover. So in this case, what I did is I added, in this case, it looks like you can put the folio label and it'll recognize it. So I put in this page, rather than saying page 3, where it would have placed up here, I added it as CV3, and so those will place correctly. Now, the next thing I did was for the body pages here. This is where it gets a little fun. Rather than just having to add that label to the front of my page number, I'm using a Dalim (eval) expression. And what this is doing is I'm telling ES I want to run a tickle command. And that tickle command is going to do 2 things. First, it's going to trim the string. So what it's going to do here is for this 3, it's going to trim that. What that's meant to do is if for some reason the regular expression picks up a space at the front or end, it's going to trim that off so we don't run into any issues doing arithmetic. It's going to trim that off, and then it's going to add 2 to whatever number it sees. So I know that the 3rd body page is really page 5 in my flat plan. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm adding 2 to whatever page number I pull out of the file name. As you can see from over here, it worked. So that my cover page, CV1, CV2, CV3, and CV4 wound up where they were supposed to go. And my body pages, though this is technically page 3, ended up on, I think I can see page number here somewhere. But even though this is technically page 3, it accommodated for the offset. So you can see here, it's folio name is 1, but it's really folio 3. So this added 2 to it to make sure it fell into the right spot. So Now, I was trying to think of other uses for this. This is the one case where it makes sense, is where you need to set a folio name. I was trying to think of other scenarios where this might be useful, and honestly, all the ones I could think of are probably better served in an actual workflow in a JavaScript program link. The one I did come up with it just for the heck of it, and I can't particularly recommend it, but I'll show it anyway just in case it's brain food for anything interesting, is I had a scenario where maybe I have a really bad file name where someone uses horribly inconsistent case in file names, because we have run into cases where like people deliver from ES to other systems where if the PDF extension isn't lowercase, the other system won't grab it or whatever. What I did here is I built a special rule, and this is doing the same thing. It's calling a special tickle command, string to lower, and it's taking the file name and casting it all to lowercase. So if I were to upload a file to the hot folder I have set up for this, fix case, then what we're going to see over here is this will create a new project first off. Yep, we got a new project. And you can see that file came in as all lowercase. So normalized it. I kind of like the idea of it as like the TWiST binding files where you could tell it which characters you wanted to remove from file names right up front, but it doesn't seem to, it's more meant for setting off like folio offsets, for example, like I was showing a minute ago, kind of simple cases. For the more complex stuff, like I was trying to find a way to remove every space from a file name, but it was kind of choking on the command I came up with, because I think one of the characters I had in there, like a bracket or something, was causing issues with the tickle interpreter. But I would stay away from it from that reason, and also because at some point, Dalim has been phasing out in ES the tickle and Java interpreters since the introduction of ES 5.5. This does still seem to be, from what I saw in ES 6, it is going to go away at some point, I believe, but be replaced with the way that you can do evaluations in JavaScript. So I wouldn't commit too much stuff in this format for that reason also. But that's everything I got for today. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, especially since you just triggered it by saying the magic words. When will ES 6 be available? I believe, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, we just got a release candidate. Is that correct? Or was that not it?
I don't think we've gotten a release candidate yet.
We did get a new candidate. Good, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think they're supposed to be in the pipeline in the next few weeks.
Right. Should be getting a release candidate soon, and I think the goal right now is end of September, sorry. Holdup seems to be right now is just subscription licensing pieces and the legal on that, since they're kind of terms and that are changing. So hopefully end of September, optimistic on this since it's a shorter window. Another question we have is, let's see, can you use file metadata to guide files in the workflow? So I guess they mean use metadata that exists in the file to build a directory structure or get it to go where you want in ES. And the answer to that, I believe, is no still, correct?
You mean routing metadata in a workflow, or using metadata?
Taking metadata in a file, like for instance, if a file has job name and folio information in metadata, not in the file name.
In the rule, you mean? Yeah, you can't do that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, you would have
that would be the ideal.
Actually, you could use something similar to what Alex was showing, where you could use file unassigned, send it to TWiST, extract that information, and then guide the file where you want to go.
That would be pretty handy, though, if there were a way that you could look at metadata and say, I want it to match this rule if and only if the metadata matches this criteria.
I've had that request in since ES2. So it is something that's been discussed during one of our technology meetings. And I think that's all we have. So on that, thanks everyone for attending. You should get the mailer with the link to the video tomorrow. As soon as we have the topic for next month's webinar, we'll get that mailer out to you, and we hope to see you then. Until then, everybody stay healthy and have a great rest of the week.